The smell hits you before your eyes adjust. Dried blood, wet earth, something animal and old underneath all of it. You are standing inside a Norse storehouse in late October, somewhere on the southwestern coast of Norway, and the temperature has dropped below freezing for the third night running. A single oil lamp burns near the door. The ground outside is starting to lock. In 4 or 5 weeks, it will be stone solid until March, and the man standing across from you is counting. He is counting hanging carcasses. He is counting sealed barrels. He is counting grain sacks, clay vessels stopped with rendered fat, dried bundles hung from every beam. He is counting the mouths in his household, probably 8 or 9 people, maybe more if he has dependents or thralls. He is counting weeks against what he can see in front of him, and the two numbers are not matching the way they need to. This is the calculation that decided whether a Norse family survived winter. Not a raid, not a storm. The gap between the food on those shelves and the calendar running in that man's head was the most dangerous thing in his world, and it had to be closed before the frost locked it shut permanently. You might wonder how any of them made it at all. No refrigeration, no commercial salt at useful scale across large parts of Norway, and almost none in Iceland, the Faroe Islands, or Greenland. No glass containers, no sterilization, no way to test whether stored meat was safe, and no way to replace a failed supply once winter sealed the landscape. The answer was not one trick or one ingredient. It was a system built across months, and every layer depended on every other layer. Remove one layer, and the household did not quietly go short. It collapsed. Welcome to the channel. If this kind of practical history interests you, subscribe and drop a comment below. And then let us get back to that storehouse. Because what that man was counting against the calendar tells us almost everything about how Norse communities survived. The first thing to understand is that the most common assumption about how the Norse solved this problem is wrong. When people think about food preservation before refrigeration, they think salt. Salt is the standard answer for medieval Europe, for Roman military campaigns, for sailing navies, for nearly every northern culture that needed to store protein through winter. In parts of Scandinavia, particularly Denmark and southern Sweden, where coastal evaporation pans and salt springs were accessible, salting was indeed a major tool. But for communities further north and west, it was not the foundation. Salt production in Viking Age Scandinavia was geographically limited. Coastal salt pans required warm, dry summers that Norway's Atlantic coast did not reliably provide. Iceland had no salt production of its own. Greenland had none. The Faroe Islands had almost none. These were not marginal communities on the edge of extinction. These were places where Norse people built functional, multi-generational societies, raised livestock, fished, navigated the open Atlantic, and produced enough surplus to sustain themselves year after year. They were solving the food preservation problem with a fundamentally different toolkit. Layered, regional, and technically more sophisticated than they are usually given credit for. But here is the part most people miss. The Norse preservation system did not begin in October when the slaughter happened. It began in late summer, during the weeks before the animals came in, when the infrastructure had to be prepared. A system that works in theory but fails in practice at the critical moment is not a system at all. Storehouses were not random outbuildings. The design carried specific survival logic. Archaeological evidence from farm sites across Iceland, Norway, and the North Atlantic settlements shows a consistent set of priorities. Storehouses were positioned to catch cold airflow, typically away from the main Longhouse, where cooking heat and animal warmth would raise interior temperatures. Food was elevated off the ground to avoid moisture and vermin. In Iceland, where timber was scarce and turf construction was standard, storehouses were sometimes built with deliberate gaps in the wall structure to allow cold air to circulate without admitting rain or snow. If you encountered one of these structures without knowing what it was, you might think it was badly built. It was doing exactly what it needed to do. Warmth was the enemy. A storehouse that held cold, moving air was not a failure. It was working correctly. Studies of Icelandic farm layouts reveal consistent orientation patterns relative to prevailing wind, suggesting that builders understood something about airflow and its effect on stored food, even without modern science to name the mechanism. The knowledge was inherited as habit. Meat dried in a well-ventilated, cold-facing structure lasted longer than meat kept in a warmer, sheltered one. That observation, repeated over enough seasons and enough failures, became rule. By late September or early October, as the grazing season ended and grass stopped growing, Norse farmers began the annual slaughter. The timing was dictated by the math of fodder. An animal kept alive from October through April required stored hay, space in the longhouse or attached byre, and constant labor. If the calculation did not support keeping that animal alive, the animal became food. The Old Norse term used in medieval Icelandic sources for this period, sometimes translated as blood month, reflects how central this moment was in the annual cycle. It was a reckoning. Selection mattered enormously. Old animals that would not survive winter, animals with poor milk or wool production. Young males not needed for the following breeding season. Keeping a productive breeding female at the cost of stored fodder was usually worth it. Slaughtering her for one season of meat was often not. This selection required specific knowledge of every individual animal on the farm. It lived in the people who worked those animals every day. Once slaughter began, the clock started. Fresh meat in cool autumn air might stay safe for a few days. In the damp, variable conditions of coastal Norway or the North Atlantic islands, that window was short. Every part of every carcass had to be processed without delay. Nothing went to waste. Not because of cultural sentiment, but because waste in October could mean hunger in February. Bones were boiled for stock and marrow. Blood, the fastest spoiling component of a freshly killed animal, was used immediately for blood sausages and puddings that could then be smoked or dried. Organs were eaten first. Fat was rendered down and stored separately in sealed clay vessels, where it could survive months and serve as a critical calorie source when everything else ran low. In areas with some access to salt, meat could be partially rubbed or packed before further processing. But partial is the key word. Norse salting in northern and western regions was not the deep brining used by later European pickling traditions. It was light, applied alongside other methods, and its specific purpose was to draw surface moisture and create an early barrier against the fastest vectors of decay. A piece of salt-rubbed mutton was almost always also smoked or dried or stored in an acidic medium. The salt was one layer of a layered process, not the complete answer. The real workhorse of Norse food preservation across the northern and western settlements was something that costs nothing, and that the Norse Atlantic world had in genuine abundance: wind. Wind drying is one of the oldest documented preservation techniques in human history, and the Norse applied it with a consistency that produced food capable of lasting not weeks, but months, and in the case of stockfish, years. The mechanism is simple. Bacteria and molds that cause decay require moisture to function. Remove moisture fast enough, and you interrupt the process before it can establish itself. Hang a piece of meat or fish in cold, dry, moving air, and the surface dries quickly enough that the interior is protected before surface decay can gain a hold. The speed of that initial drying is what matters most. Too slow, and you end up with food rotting internally while appearing dry on the outside. Fast enough, and you have something that can be stored, transported, and traded across ocean routes without any other treatment. The conditions along the Lofoten coast in northern Norway during winter are almost ideal for this process.
Temperatures hold near freezing. The air coming off the Atlantic is relatively dry for a coastal environment. The wind is reliable and persistent. Archaeological evidence and medieval Norwegian sources confirm that stockfish, wind-dried cod hung on large wooden racks called gjell, was already established production in the Viking Age, and likely earlier. The fish was split, gutted, and hung in late winter when temperature, humidity, and wind aligned correctly, then left to dry for several months until they reached a hardness requiring soaking before they could be eaten. A piece of properly dried stockfish could last 2 years or more without any additional treatment. No salt, no cold storage. A kilogram of it carried roughly the energy of several kilograms of fresh fish in a package that weighed almost nothing. But not every Norse community had access to Lofoten conditions. This is where the system becomes stranger than most accounts suggest. Inland farms and highland communities in Norway and Icelandic farms away from productive fishing grounds had to adapt the same principle to different materials. Mutton was wind-dried, using the same basic logic as stockfish, but required different handling and different infrastructure. In Iceland, wind-dried lamb and its smoked form became a cornerstone of winter diet. Medieval Icelandic sagas reference preserved lamb in ways that reflect familiarity rather than novelty. Food residue analysis at excavated Norse sites shows the consistent presence of processed sheep products, and the tradition survived into the present day as functional food still eaten in Iceland, not as heritage performance, but as part of an actual diet. The smell of properly wind-dried meat is intense and permanent. It is not unpleasant to people raised around it, but it is not subtle. A Norse storehouse actively drying meat carried a sensory signature that followed the household through every waking hour. This is not a detail of atmosphere. It is a signal that the system was working. Here is what descriptions of this process rarely include. Wind drying was not passive. It required continuous monitoring and active management. A period of warm, wet weather during the critical early drying phase could rehydrate the surface of hanging meat and create exactly the moist, warm environment that spoilage bacteria needed to establish themselves. A piece of meat that appeared dry on the outside could be actively decomposing beneath the surface if conditions had shifted at the wrong moment. Norse households managing drying racks had to track weather the way a modern farmer tracks a forecast, and had to be prepared to move product indoors or increase smoking on short notice. A failed drying season was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe with no recovery option until the following autumn. Smoke was the second major layer, and it worked through a different mechanism than drying. Smoking reduces surface moisture, which helps, but its primary function is chemical. Wood smoke contains phenols, aldehydes, and organic acids that are directly inhibitory to the microorganisms responsible for decay. A piece of meat or fish that has been properly smoked carries a chemical coat that extends its safe storage life significantly beyond what drying alone would achieve. Norse families did not know the chemistry. They knew the result, which is the only knowledge that matters when your food supply is your survival plan. The choice of smoking fuel was not arbitrary. Birch was the most widely available hardwood across Scandinavia and produced a clean smoke with effective preserving properties. In Iceland and the Faroe Islands, where trees were scarce or absent after early settlement, peat was the primary fuel, producing a quality that permeates food deeply and is still associated with Icelandic food today. Juniper, where it grew, was valued for its direct antibacterial properties, understood empirically long before modern science could explain the mechanism. The Longhouse itself was part of the smoking infrastructure. A Norse longhouse with an active central hearth produced a continuous light haze that filled the upper space of the building. Food hung in the rafters above the fire was simultaneously being dried by the convection from below and smoked by the constant low-level combustion of the hearth. The architecture and the food supply were a single integrated system. The Longhouse was not a place where people happened to also store food. The design included food preservation as one of its core functions. Now let us talk about dairy, because this is where Norse food technology diverges most sharply from the traditions most people carry as their reference point. Norse dairy culture did not center on fresh milk and long-aged, hard cheeses. It centered on fermentation, specifically on two products engineered from the start to survive, rather than to be consumed immediately: Skyr and sour whey. Skyr is described today as something similar to yogurt or fresh cheese, which is accurate as a starting point, but misses the practical function. In the Viking Age, Skyr was made by adding a small amount of existing skyr, which carried live bacterial cultures, to fresh whole milk, and allowing fermentation to run until the milk curdled. The fermentation process dropped the pH of the product significantly, creating an acidic environment hostile to the spoilage bacteria that would otherwise destroy fresh dairy within a day or two in autumn temperatures. Properly made skyr, stored in a cool environment, lasted weeks rather than days. In the context of a Norse winter supply plan, that difference was not minor. It was the difference between a dairy product that contributed to the household's nutrition across months and one that was gone almost immediately. The skyr culture itself had to be protected and maintained through the entire winter season, potentially requiring a winter journey to a neighboring farm if the starter was lost. The culture was maintained with the same care as seed grain or breeding stock. Sour whey, called misa in Old Norse, was the liquid byproduct of skyr production. In most modern food traditions, whey is processing waste. In Norse households, it was a second preservation tool. The same acidity that made skyr resistant to spoilage made the whey an effective medium for preserving other foods. Meat submerged in sour whey was protected from the bacteria that caused the fastest and most dangerous forms of decay. Evidence from Greenland Norse archaeological sites suggests that sour whey was used as a pickling medium for meat cuts that had not been dried or smoked. The byproduct of one preservation process became the active agent of another. The system produced no waste. Every output fed the next process. The evidence from Greenland Norse sites shows what the system looked like under extreme pressure. Analysis of food remains from excavated settlements, including Gardar, shows a diet built from dried marine mammal products, dried fish, dairy ferments, and small quantities of traded grain. These communities were operating at the absolute edge of the northern agricultural zone, with growing seasons that were short and sometimes failed entirely. They sustained themselves there for roughly 400 years. That is the product of a food system disciplined enough to function at the boundary of the survivable, not luck. Cold storage was another layer, and in northern climates, it represented a genuine structural advantage. A stone-lined pit dug below frost depth maintained a temperature near or just above freezing year-round. Norse farm layouts in Iceland and Greenland regularly included below-grade storage chambers integrated into the turf structure of the main buildings. These were designed into the farm from construction, not added as an afterthought. Cold storage did not work alone. A piece of smoked, wind-dried mutton held in a cold cellar lasted longer than either smoking, drying, or cold storage could achieve on its own. The system was additive. Each layer extended what the previous layer had established, and here is the layer that rarely appears in any account, the one that may have been the most important of all: ration discipline. Knowing you had enough food was not enough. You had to consume it at a rate that matched the calendar. A Norse household eating their winter stores without systematic tracking could reach the hungry weeks of late February or early March and discover that what they had counted as sufficient in October was not. The problem was not simple overconsumption. It was the natural tendency to eat more during the coldest months, when the body demanded more energy and the weight of winter was at its heaviest. Ration management required deliberate, ongoing assessment from October through to the first spring grazing, and it required authority within the household to enforce it, even when people were cold and hungry. The Icelandic sagas carry consistent references to food stress, difficult winters, and the social obligations that required wealthier farms to support struggling neighbors during scarcity. This was not charity as an abstract moral value. It was a practical survival mechanism for the cluster of farms that made up a functional Norse community. A household that allowed its neighbors to starve lost the labor, skills, and mutual support those neighbors provided. The Gragas, the earliest surviving Icelandic law code, contains provisions about food obligations between neighbors and the responsibilities of a household head during scarcity. This legal framework was built on the lived reality of food stress. The law was catching failures that the system could not always prevent. If you have ever managed a winter in a place where resupply was truly difficult, or stretched a food supply further than it was designed to go, drop a comment below.
Because the calculation Norse household heads were running every week through January and February
was not as remote from practical human experience as it might seem. Now, let us look at where the system failed, because it did, regularly. Botulism is caused by a toxin produced by a bacterium that thrives in low oxygen, low acid environments. Improperly fermented or incompletely processed meat and fish are classic vectors. Viking-age Norse communities almost certainly encountered botulism poisoning, though historical sources do not name it as a distinct condition. The practical response was inspection. Every visit to a storehouse was an act of assessment using appearance, texture, and smell. But botulinum toxin in its early stages produces no obvious smell.
A piece of meat stored in conditions that allowed the toxin to develop could appear and smell normal while being actively dangerous. Their system could reduce this risk, but could not eliminate it. Survival was earned. It was not guaranteed. The layer most vulnerable to failure was fermentation. Skyr made with a weak culture that did not drop the pH fast enough, or meat preserved in sour whey that was not sufficiently acidic, could produce food that appeared normal, but lacked the chemical protection it needed. A smoking process interrupted before completion could produce food with the external appearance of having been smoked, but without the inhibiting compounds that complete smoking provided. When that knowledge failed, as it sometimes must have, the consequences were absorbed without external help and without the ability to replace what was lost. Grain stored across winter was also vulnerable to ergot, a fungal infection producing toxins that cause convulsions and circulatory damage. A contaminated grain supply threatened not only nutrition, but the physical function of everyone eating from it. Norse grain storage practices, drying grain before storage, maintaining airflow, keeping grain elevated from the ground, reflected practical understanding of this risk without a scientific framework to explain it. Here is where the system produced its most unusual solution. Greenlandic shark flesh, in its fresh state, contains compounds that make the raw fish physiologically toxic to humans. The fermentation process, used by Greenland Norse communities,
Involving extended decomposition over several months in specific conditions, converts these toxic compounds into less harmful forms, while the ammonia-rich environment simultaneously inhibits spoilage bacteria. The result is a food that is physiologically safe, provides protein and fat, and requires no salt, no smoke, no drying racks, and no specialized infrastructure beyond time and ground. For a community with access to large quantities of Greenlandic shark and limited other preservation resources, this was not eccentricity. It was a rational solution to a specific problem in a specific place. The Norse sailor carried the food preservation problem into its most demanding context. A ship at sea in the North Atlantic was a moving storehouse with no resupply option.
The food taken aboard for a long ship voyage was selected because it had already been preserved to maximum stable form. Stockfish, dried mutton, hard bread, sour whey in sealed barrels. There was no cooking on most open water crossings. The crew ate cold, preserved food for days or weeks at a time. High-protein, low-moisture diets increased the metabolic demand for water, which meant managing food and water supply simultaneously and in tension. Dietary discipline was a practical skill, as critical as the ability to read weather or manage a sail. Now, every layer of the system comes back to that storehouse. The yell, full of drying cod, stood in the cold coastal air. The smoked mutton hung in the rafters above the Longhouse fire. The Skyr culture lived in its clay vessel through month after month of winter.
The sour whey barrels extended the life of cuts that had been neither fully dried nor fully smoked.
The cold cellar, below the farm floor, held its temperature near freezing. The ration calculation was checked weekly against the count of weeks remaining. And the network of neighboring farms stood ready to support a household that fell short, not as charity, but as mutual insurance in a system where individual failure threatened the whole. Every one of these was a layer. Every layer solved a physical problem that the others could not solve alone. Remove the drying racks, and the smoking has to compensate for what drying did not do. Remove the cold cellar, and the fermented dairy has less time on its side. Remove the ration discipline, and the food that should have lasted until April is gone in February.
Remove the social network, and a single failed harvest destroys a household instead of being absorbed by the cluster. We can go back to the storehouse now. The lamp is burning down. The man is still counting. He is not counting food against abstract hunger. He is running every layer of his system in his head simultaneously. The fish on the drying racks measured against the weeks before fresh fish become available again. The Skyr culture measured against the months before the first used lamb and fresh milk returns. The sour whey barrels measured against the smoked meat that has to last until spring. He is checking whether the mathematics of 8 or 9 lives across a Norwegian winter adds up to survival. No instruments, no written records, no second chances. The remarkable thing is not that Norse households sometimes failed at this.
Given everything working against them, some failure was inevitable. The remarkable thing is how rarely they failed, and where the system held. It kept communities alive in Iceland for over 1,000 years. It sustained Greenland Norse settlements at the edge of the habitable world for 4 centuries. It carried sailors across the widest ocean a Viking Age navigator could conceive of, on food made safe by wind and time, and the accumulated knowledge of people who could not afford to be wrong. The man in the storehouse picks up his lamp and walks back to the Longhouse. The count is close enough. Not comfortable, not a surplus. Close enough.